Alright, so in the last couple of years, Sony has come out with a bunch of different cameras, in particular the Sony A7IV and the Sony FX6. Now, because of my gear acquisition syndrome and my need to spend a bunch of money, I not only have the Sony A7IV, but I also have the Sony FX6. And in today's video, we're going to find out which one is better, and is getting a cinema camera even worth it in 2022? What's going on, guys? KY, not Kai the Creative. I'm a filmmaker and photographer based out of Toronto, Ontario, where most of my stuff lives in the fitness industry, but I also know to do a couple other things as well. In today's video, we want to pit against each other a hybrid camera like the Sony A7IV versus the highly looked after Sony FX6 and finding out which one is better. Now, the Sony FX6 is a cinema camera, and we're here to find out, is it even worth it to go and spend the money in waiting for a cinema camera, or can we do just fine with using something like a Sony A7IV? Alright, so for this test, I'm going to compare a little bit of footage that I got on the Sony A7IV versus the FX6 in a situation that I'm mostly familiar with, which is shooting in a gym. Now, what we're going to do is we're actually going to compare the quality of the two cameras together. So the Sony A7IV and the Sony FX6 match up pretty well. I did shoot an S-Log3 on both of these cameras, and I will say from a color perspective, the Sony A7IV does match up quite well with the Sony FX6. Now, what I will say is the fact that they both can shoot in 10-bit 4K, the Sony A7IV is a little bit sharper, and that's because it does something called downsampling, where it just takes a higher resolution image and it actually downsamples a 4K image from it, where you're going to get a 1-to-1 on a FX6. Now, I did do a very soft, not scientific dynamic range test, because when I'm shooting in gyms, the most dynamic thing I'm going to find is shooting from inside of the gym with a window that is outside. So I put my talent Wyatt right beside the window when he's doing some exercises, which is going to be the most dynamic range setup I'm actually going to end up having, and I actually pitted those two against each other to find that they look almost exactly the same. Now, it was a little bit of a difficulty to find a dynamic range difference between the two cameras, but clearly the two colors are slightly different from each other. But when you know how to use DaVinci Resolve, you can get these two camera images to match up almost identically and indistinguishable from one to the other. That being said, I guess technically the A7IV wins on image quality. Now we're going to go into the shooting modes, where you're going to find that the FX6 has a lot more variety than something like an A7IV. Now, the A7IV does have that downsampled 4K, so it is a little bit more sharper in detail, and can also do 4K 60 as well. Now, a gigantic complaint and a gigantic caveat to a lot of people with this camera is that its 4K 60 is going to be cropped. Now, what that means is that there's going to be a 1.5 times crop on your images when shooting in 4K 60 frames a second. So your 20mm lens is going to be somewhere around your 30mm lens, so on and so forth. So whatever focal length you're shooting at, times that by 1.5, and that's going to be your crop factor. That being said, it also offers a full frame 1080p in 120 frames a second in 10-bit, which is a step up from the camera before it in the Sony A7 III. Now, that might be a deal breaker for some people shooting in 4K 60, but in my personal opinion, it's not the biggest deal in the world. When I'm shooting in slow motion, I'm shooting 60 frames a second, I tend to actually use tighter lenses and tighter focal lengths as well to make sure I get those details in slow motion. Now, me being someone that shoots a lot of sports, a lot of fitness and things like that, it doesn't matter a lot to me, because I will be using tighter lenses like 35s, 50mm, and sometimes 85s, so having to crop in actually just makes my life a little bit easier. Now, using something like the Sony FX6, you're going to have a lot more options for you. Now, the Sony FX6 not only can shoot in 4K full frame, but it also does 60 and 120 frames at 4K in full frame as well. And now it also offers a very cool 240 frames a second, which you can only get in 1080p, but that is going to be twice the slow motion as you will find in 120. Now, built-in ND filter is a big feature you're going to find in a lot of modern cinema cameras. Basically, what that means is that you can change your exposure on the fly without changing the rest of your camera settings. So if you're somebody, for example, that shoots with shallower depth of field, maybe you're shooting at f2, f2.8, or even at f1.8 or lower, you're going to find that having a built-in ND filter is going to come in handy for you. Now, on a mirrorless camera like a Sony A7IV, you can use external ND filters. Now, with that, you might actually have a decreased image quality or some color casting because you're putting glass on top of another piece of glass, where the Sony FX6 and other cinema cameras have that feature built in. In fact, the Sony FX6 actually has automatic NDs. So if you do set your automatic ND filter at the press of a button, whether you're going from outside to inside, your ND filter will do the rest of the work for you. So you don't actually have to change a setting or turn the actual ND filter itself on your lens. Your camera takes care of that, so you can focus on composition and getting the shot. Now, with built-in NDs, that might be a slam dunk between someone who's undecided between a hybrid camera and a cinema camera, but there's something the A7IV does that the Sony FX6 can't, and that's take photos. Which should give up losing a few video features you gain in high quality photography. So if you're someone that's more of a hybrid shooter, someone that works in both photography and video, the A7IV is not only a no-brainer, but it's actually honestly honestly your only option between these two cameras. All right, so getting into what it looks like in real life to actually use these two cameras when they're set up, the Sony A7 IV is a lot more smaller and a lot more portable. And it looks pretty much just like your normal vlogging camera. Now, I have a 35mm lens on here, but if you want to vlog or you want to do something smaller, you could actually use a smaller lens, something a little bit more wide angle that's a little bit more inconspicuous. And it has a flip out screen, so if you want to see yourself, you can still use that. So it has all those features that you want to use for vlogging, short run and gun types of shoots, and it doesn't draw too much attention to yourself because this guy is fairly small. And then you have something like a Sony FX6. This is a much bigger camera. It looks like you're shooting a commercial, looks like you're gonna be shooting a movie or something for Netflix. And fun fact, this camera is Netflix approved. But when you see these two cameras beside each other, like this one is significantly bigger. Now there's a lot more dedicated video features, hence its size. But if you want to be somewhere where you're a little bit inconspicuous, you don't want to get kind of called out for shooting something, or you don't want to get approached by too many people, you might not want to go with this. You might want to get something a lot smaller like a Sony A7 IV. So what I am going to say is that there are two other factors you want to consider when buying this camera, and that's going to be pricing and availability. Right now, the time of shooting this video, the Sony A7 IV is almost 1/3 the price as the Sony FX6, with the Sony A7 IV coming in at $2,500 and the Sony FX6 coming in at $6,000, about $9,000 in Canadian. So you are going to save quite a bit of money going with the Sony A7 IV while keeping up some of that image quality. But if you're dedicated to video and you have those clients that are giving you that type of budget where you can afford something like an FX6, it's the way to go. But there's one more roadblock, and that's availability. Now, at the time of shooting this video right now, the Sony FX6 is one of the hardest cinema cameras to pick up. Now, if you go on B&H and check out their website, you might be waiting till 2023 in order to get your hands on this camera. But I will say there's a pro tip. When you are looking for hot items like the Sony FX6, try your smaller mom and pop shops. Try those smaller camera stores because they're still going to get orders, maybe at a lesser frequency, but there might be less people waiting in line. Now, great audio is essential to having great video. You can forgive a poor quality image if it has great audio, but if you're somebody that has a great image quality but terrible audio, it takes people not out of the story, but a lot of times you won't actually finish whatever you're watching. And that's where the Sony FX6 pulls ahead from the A7 IV. Now, XLR inputs versus its counterpart does have the ability to have higher quality audio sources. So you can use XLR shotgun mics or XLR lavalier mics, and as well as it actually features two of these ports in that top handle versus the A7 IV's one audio jack that's just a 3.5mm jack that you will see in a lot of common cameras, especially mirrorless and DSLRs. Okay, so one of the things I forgot to mention about these two cameras is the stabilization, where the Sony FX6 again doesn't have it just like photography features, but the Sony A7 IV does. Now, the Sony A7 IV is a smaller camera, which means that if you have caffeine hands just like mine, you are going to have a little bit of micro shake if you're not using it. And if you guys don't know, having a heavier camera means it's going to be a lot easier to stabilize. So comparing these two shots together, there is more of a natural kind of swaying and a shaking, and there isn't the micro jitters that you would see on a mirrorless camera if you didn't have in-body stabilization. Now we're going to look at the design of these two cameras. Now the Sony A7 IV has a lot of the common settings that you would see in a mirrorless camera, especially in the Sony line. But a new added feature to it is that it has a mode dial. So I can change from my normal video shooting mode to photography to even my S&Q modes, and I can actually put in 3 custom settings for each of those modes. That way, if I need to change my settings on the fly or there's a certain shooting mode that I want to access, I can do that without having to go through the menu and slowing myself down. Now the Sony FX6, being a more dedicated video shooter, has the ability for you to have all the controls on the side panel of the camera. And I find that a little bit more easier to use than something like a Sony A7 IV. When I need to change my settings on the fly, it's normally one button push, or it's accessing the quick menu that's located on this camera as well, and I can use all the features that I want to in this camera. And I don't have to worry about going through menu settings and anything like that. I can press one button, I can access the things that I need to. So on the Sony FX6, it does have a lot more video features, and it gives you access to those a little bit quicker than you would on something like a mirrorless camera. And the last thing we're going to talk about is going to be client perception, and whether or not having a bigger camera or a smaller camera actually matters, and does it all come down to the final product. Now, I will say between having these two cameras, I do reserve them for certain jobs. Now, when I'm doing certain smaller social media type of jobs where I'm only capturing footage for, say, reels or really small forms of content, I will bring a mirrorless camera like the Sony A7 IV or even the FX3 that I have. Now, when I'm working with bigger brands and the budget's a little bit bigger, or I'm working with a crew, I do bring my Sony FX6. Now, the reason why I do do that is not only because I want more dedicated video features, but also the client perception in terms of do they feel like their money is actually going to good use does play a role when you do have a bigger camera and a larger setup. Now, it would be a lie if I said I haven't been called out for using a smaller camera on a gig. Actually, a couple of weeks ago, I did bring my Sony A7IV in order to capture some content for an event, and I was asked if I was going to be using smaller cameras for the rest of my career or just going forward working with them. And they didn't really mean that as a joke. I think they were actually kind of serious in terms of their concern of whether or not I'm using a bigger or a smaller camera. And what I don't think clients realize is when you see that final product, it doesn't necessarily matter how big or small a camera is. But I will say, if they're the ones paying my bills, I'm going to go and get a bigger camera with more dedicated features and give that reinforcement to my clients that they've obviously put their money to good use. Now, this does beg the question, which one do I recommend between the Sony FX6 and the Sony A7IV? And obviously it's going to be a little bit of a mixed bag because both of these two cameras are great, but they do have different functionalities and different purposes. Now, if you're somebody that works with bigger crews, you've dedicated yourself to video, the Sony FX6 is made for you. It has all the stuff that you need from an audio and a visual perspective in order for you to get high quality video that not only you can use on commercial shoots, but you could also use for corporate videos, advertisements, and everything that you need in order to soar yourself up in terms of the ranks and being a cinematographer. Now, the Sony A7IV, albeit has the greatest image quality, it's also more of a hybrid shooter camera. Now, the A7IV is great at a whole bunch of things, but it's not a master of any one of them. It has great video features, but it doesn't necessarily have the full frame goodness that you want in something like a cinema camera, especially the new ones these days. And it does have great photography features, but it's no Sony A1 or even an A9. It's something that you could use on a wedding shoot, a portrait shoot, or just getting social media content. And as well as using the video features, they're super sharp, it's super high quality, it matches well with some of the other cameras. Now, that being said, I will say that I'm using the A7IV a little bit more often. That's just because of the nature of the jobs that I'm doing. A lot of jobs I've been doing recently have been a lot more smaller social media shoots where I do use my Sony FX6 for more branded work, more branded documentary stuff, and a little bit more on the filmmaking side of my work. So I will say the Sony A7IV I take in my bag because it's a little bit easier to carry and it does create good video, but I will say that if I do have a big project and I do have a bigger budget, I will be using my Sony FX6 99% of the time. That being said, this is going to be the end of the video. I have to get off of this floor, but leave a comment down below. Which camera do you prefer, the Sony A7IV or the Sony FX6? Do you like the mirrorless cameras, or have you stepped up to cinema and you're not going back? That being said, this has been KY, not Kai the Creative, and I'll see you guys in the next one. God, this floor is disgusting. I should have swept before I did this.